Lake Tahoe in the early 1960s felt like a different country compared to Las Vegas. The air was thinner, cleaner, and quieter. Pine trees framed the water like sentries guarding something sacred. The lodge perched near the shoreline carried an air of luxury, but also of secrecy. Men with expensive watches and quiet reputations preferred places like this, places where conversations didn't echo beyond the walls. Dean Martin never fully trusted quiet places like that. He liked noise, music, laughter, the predictable chaos of a showroom. Silence, especially when layered with wealth and power, usually meant something was being negotiated. The weekend had begun innocently enough. No performances scheduled, no press, just a retreat for a few days away from the stage lights. Dean, Sammy Davis Jr., then and a small circle of friends planned nothing more complicated than dinner, drinks, and a late-night card game. Sammy was in a good mood that evening. He always carried an energy that seemed bigger than the room. It wasn't just talent, it was hunger. He had fought too hard to reach those rooms to ever sit quietly inside them. He laughed loudly, moved quickly, spoke with enthusiasm. Every opportunity still felt earned. Dean admired that about him. They had just sat down in a private dining room overlooking the lake when the mood shifted. Not dramatically, not with shouting, just with presence. A man entered who did not knock. He was not introduced formally. He did not need to be. He wore authority the way other men wore suits, comfortably as if tailored specifically for him. And behind him stood two men who said nothing but made it clear that silence was intentional. Dean felt the air tighten. The host of the lodge stood quickly and forced a smile. Greetings were exchanged. Chairs were rearranged. The evening, which had been casual seconds before, now felt curated. The man at the center of it all, the Don, as people whispered, sat at the head of the table without asking. Dean noticed that Sammy's laughter quieted. At first, conversation flowed harmlessly. Stories about Chicago, about business ventures, about mutual friends. The Don spoke in a tone that was never loud but always controlled. It wasn't anger that carried weight. It was certainty. Sammy tried to keep things light. He cracked a joke. He imitated a television personality. The room laughed, though some of the laughter felt rehearsed. Then the Don turned his attention fully toward Sammy. "You're a remarkable performer," he said slowly. "You can be anyone." Sammy smiled politely. "That's the idea." The Don studied him for a moment too long. "Must be useful, being able to shift, adapt." The tone wasn't praise, it was assessment. Dean leaned back slightly, watching. "I've always wondered," the Don continued, "does it get tiring? Performing everywhere? Trying to fit in wherever you go?" The table grew still. Sammy's smile didn't disappear. It froze. "I fit just fine," Sammy replied carefully. The Don's eyes sharpened. "Some rooms don't change for anyone." There it was. Not a slur, not an outburst, just the implication. Dean set down his glass. He had grown up around men like this. Men who tested boundaries softly before crossing them. The men who believed status granted them the right to decide who belonged and who didn't. Sammy had faced prejudice his entire life. He carried it like invisible armor. But armor still absorbs impact. The Don leaned closer. "Talent doesn't always equal respect." The words lingered. Dean didn't stand immediately. He didn't shout. He didn't dramatize the moment. He simply spoke. "That's enough." The room reacted before the Don did. The bodyguards shifted. The host inhaled sharply. The Don slowly turned his head toward Dean. "Excuse me?" Dean's voice stayed even. "We're here for dinner, not a lecture." The Don studied him. "You think I'm insulting your friend? I think you know exactly what you're doing." Silence expanded. The Don smiled, but it was not warmth. It was calculation. "Careful," he said. "You're very comfortable for someone in my house." Dean held his gaze. No one here is comfortable. The atmosphere changed from tension to confrontation. Sammy quietly whispered, "Dean." But Dean raised a hand gently without looking at him. "You don't get to question his place at this table," Dean continued calmly. "He earned it." The Don's expression hardened. "You willing to stake your comfort on that belief?" Dean didn't hesitate. "Yes." The weight of that single word settled heavily. The Don leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. "Loyalty is expensive. So is disrespect," Dean replied. The standoff lasted only seconds, but it felt much longer. Finally, the Don waved his hand dismissively. "Eat your dinner." But the damage had been done. The meal ended quickly after that. No dessert, no lingering laughter. Just quiet exits. Outside, the night air felt sharper. Sammy walked beside Dean without speaking for several moments. When he finally did, his voice carried both gratitude and worry. "You shouldn't have done that." Dean lit a cigarette and stared out at the lake. "Yeah, I should have." "He's not a man you challenge." "I didn't challenge him. I corrected him." Sammy looked down at the dock beneath their feet. "You could have let it slide." Dean shook his head. "That's how it starts. You let it slide once, then again. Then eventually you forget you ever had a line." Sammy was quiet. The lake reflected the moon like polished glass. It looked peaceful, untouched by human tension. But Dean understood something Sammy didn't fully grasp yet. Standing up had consequences. Men like that Don did not forget embarrassment. They collected it, and they repaid it. Dean knew he might have just bought trouble. For himself, maybe even for the entire group. But he also knew something else. If he had stayed silent, that moment would have lived in Sammy's memory far longer than any confrontation ever could. And some silences are more dangerous than any threat. Behind them, inside the lodge, the Don remained seated long after the others left. He did not rage. He did not shout. He simply watched the empty doorway where Dean had exited. A man unused to being challenged rarely responds impulsively. He responds strategically. The lake remained calm that night. But beneath calm water, currents move quietly. And by morning, those currents would begin to shift. The morning after the dinner carried an artificial calm, at the kind that settles over a place when everyone knows something significant has happened, but no one is willing to name it aloud. The lake was still. Sunlight shimmered across the water, as if the world had decided to ignore the tension lingering inside the lodge. Staff moved carefully, speaking in lowered tones. Word travels quickly in insulated environments, especially when power is involved, and by breakfast nearly everyone knew there had been a confrontation. They did not know the details. They did not need to. They knew enough to understand that a line had been crossed. Dean noticed the subtle shift immediately. The maitre d', who had once greeted him with relaxed familiarity, now carried a strained politeness. The bellman avoided eye contact. Conversation stopped half a second too soon when he entered a room. None of it was overt hostility. It was caution. Caution radiates outward from influence, and the Don's influence was not a secret. Even when he was not physically present, his gravity remained. Sammy tried to act normal that morning. He joked about the coffee being too strong and teased Dean about his habit of waking up before everyone else. But beneath the humor was tension. Dean could see it in the way Sammy's shoulders stayed slightly raised, as if bracing. Humiliation is rarely loud. It is quiet and internal. What hurt Sammy most was not the implication itself. He had faced worse. But the reminder that even in rooms filled with friends, someone could attempt to reduce him to something smaller. Dean understood that kind of wound. It lingers longer than insults shouted in anger because it comes wrapped in civility. By midday, the pressure began to reveal itself more clearly. The lodge manager approached Dean privately and spoke in carefully chosen words. There had been concerns about certain guests feeling uncomfortable. There were recommendations about adjusting plans. It was never stated directly, but the message was clear. Remaining at the lodge was no longer encouraged. The Don had not issued threats. He did not need to. Influence operates more efficiently through suggestion than force. Dean listened quietly and nodded without argument. He knew this pattern. It was the beginning of soft isolation. When he returned to Sammy, he found him standing alone near the shoreline, skipping small stones across the water. Sammy did not turn around when Dean approached. "We're being squeezed, aren't we?" he asked without looking back. And Dean did not soften the truth. "Yeah," he said, "we are." There was no panic in his voice, only acknowledgement. Sammy let out a slow breath. "I've had gigs canceled before," he said. "I've had hotel reservations disappear. I've had doors close in ways that no one would ever admit were intentional. I just didn't expect it here." Dean placed a hand on his shoulder. "That's why it matters," he said, "because it happened here." The Don did not confront Dean again that day. Instead, he hosted a private luncheon on the opposite side of the property, inviting local businessmen and a handful of industry representatives. It was not coincidence. It was positioning. Visibility matters. So does narrative control. By evening, whispers circulated that Dean had been disrespectful and difficult. Reputation, in certain circles, I can shift overnight if the right version of events spreads. Dean understood the mechanics. He had seen careers dented not by scandal but by suggestion. Frank called late that afternoon. His voice carried strain, though he tried to mask it with casual humor. "He's not happy," Frank admitted quietly. Dean did not ask who he was. "I figured." Frank hesitated before continuing. "There are ways to smooth this out." Dean exhaled slowly. "You mean apologize?" "I mean recalibrate," Frank replied. "You don't have to mean it. Just say it." Dean looked out at the lake, considering the simplicity of that option. A few words could restore equilibrium. A handshake could undo the friction. But he also understood what those words would signal. They would signal that the humiliation was negotiable, that loyalty had limits, that dignity was adjustable depending on who sat at the head of the table. "No," Dean said gently. "I won't recalibrate." Frank did not argue further. Silence settled on the line before he spoke again, softer this time. "Then be ready for the fallout." Dean was already ready. The fallout did not arrive in dramatic form. It arrived quietly, strategically. A booking in Reno was suddenly rescheduled. A radio appearance in Chicago encountered logistical issues. A television producer who had once been enthusiastic about a collaborative special now expressed vague concerns about timing. None of it was traceable. None of it could be confronted directly. It was the kind of pressure designed to frustrate without providing a target. Dean absorbed it without outward complaint. He had enough stability in his career to weather turbulence. And Sammy, however, did not carry the same insulation. Within 2 weeks, Sammy received notice that a planned engagement at a major venue was under review. The official explanation referenced programming adjustments. Unofficially, the message was clearer. Certain investors preferred a quieter season. Sammy read the letter twice before setting it down. Dean watched him process it. The hurt was not just professional, it was existential. "This is what he meant," Sammy said quietly. "Respect." Dean shook his head. "No," he said firmly. "This is what insecurity looks like when it has money behind it." Dean made a decision that evening without announcing it. He called the venue directly and informed them that if Sammy's booking disappeared, so would his own upcoming dates. And the silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough to confirm the calculation unfolding there. Financial considerations shift quickly when they become mutual. The following morning, Sammy's engagement was reinstated without explanation. Dean did not tell Sammy immediately. He let the official confirmation arrive first. When Sammy read it, relief mixed with disbelief. "You did this," he said. Dean shrugged lightly. "I reminded them what they're risking." The gesture carried consequences of its own. Aligning publicly meant increasing visibility. It meant the narrative could no longer isolate Sammy without affecting Dean. It also meant the Don's quiet influence would need to escalate or retreat. Dean understood that escalation often burns brighter than retreat. He braced for it. What arrived instead was something more complex. An invitation, not to dinner, not to confrontation, but to conversation. The Don requested a private meeting at a neutral location, an office suite in Los Angeles known for discretion. Dean considered ignoring it. Ignoring power can be effective. But he also understood that unresolved tension festers. If there was to be a resolution, it needed clarity. The office was understated, decorated in muted tones that signaled wealth without excess. The Don greeted Dean with calm civility, as if the previous confrontation had been a minor misunderstanding. "You've made your point," the Don said evenly. "And you've made yours," Dean replied. The Don studied him, searching for weakness. "You're costing yourself opportunities," he said. "Possibly," Dean answered, "but not my self-respect." The Don's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in evaluation. "You're willing to risk stability for symbolism." Dean leaned forward. "It's not symbolism. It's a friend." The conversation did not explode into hostility. It unfolded like a chess match. The Don made clear that influence has long memory. Dean made clear that intimidation has diminishing returns. There were no raised voices, no overt threats, just an acknowledgement of boundaries. When Dean stood to leave, the Don spoke one final sentence. "Loyalty can be admirable," he said, "but it can also be expensive." Dean paused at the door. "Then I'll pay," he replied calmly. Over time, the pressure eased, not because the Don conceded, but because escalation would have required visibility neither side wanted. Public conflict attracts scrutiny. Scrutiny complicates influence. The equilibrium that followed was not friendship. It was distance. Professional interference diminished. Invitations no longer overlapped. Paths diverged quietly. For Sammy, the experience left a lasting imprint. He carried renewed confidence on stage, but also sharper awareness of the fragility of access. Dean's stance had not erased prejudice. It had not dismantled influence networks. But it had established a precedent. Silence was not mandatory. Loyalty was not optional. And dignity did not require permission. Years later, when people asked Dean why he had taken such risks over a dinner conversation, he rarely provided a dramatic answer. "Because it was right," he would say simply. That simplicity masked complexity. He had weighed the cost. He had understood the danger. He had chosen anyway. Not impulsively, but deliberately. The lake eventually returned to being just a lake. And the lodge hosted new guests. New stories replaced old whispers. But for those who had been there that night, the memory remained sharp. Not because of violence or spectacle, but because of what almost happened and what did not. A humiliation attempted, a line drawn, a friendship tested, and a choice made. Dean never framed himself as brave. He understood fear too well to romanticize it. Courage, as he later reflected privately, is not the absence of fear. It is the refusal to let fear dictate who you protect. And on that night by the water, he had decided exactly who he was willing to protect, regardless of the cost. The months that followed the confrontation did not explode into violence or public scandal. Instead, they settled into something quieter and more enduring, consequence without spectacle. And that is often how influence operates. It does not need drama. It works through absence, through hesitation, through subtle withdrawal of opportunity. Dean understood this pattern well. He had been in the industry long enough to know that a door closing rarely slams. It simply stops opening. Sammy felt it first. There were fewer spontaneous invitations. Certain private gatherings no longer included his name. A few venues that had once been eager now required scheduling reviews. None of it could be traced back directly to one man, yet the timing was too precise to dismiss. Influence is rarely direct. It moves through people who owe favors, through managers who fear risk, through investors who prefer calm waters. The Don did not need to issue commands. All he had to do was raise an eyebrow in the right room. What complicated everything was that Sammy refused to show defeat. On stage, he burned brighter. His performances became sharper, more intense, almost defiant. Audiences felt it without understanding why. There was a new edge in his timing, a new gravity behind his laughter. When he sang, there was something under the notes, a resilience forged by friction. Dean watched from the wings some nights, recognizing that adversity, when survived, can deepen artistry. Yet offstage, Sammy wrestled privately with doubt. It is one thing to tell a man he belongs. It is another for the world to reinforce it. Late one evening after a show in Las Vegas, Sammy sat alone in his dressing room long after the applause faded. Dean found him staring at his reflection, still in costume, stage lights dimmed to a low glow. You ever get tired?" Sammy asked quietly, without turning around. Dean leaned against the doorframe. "Of what?" "Proving it," Sammy replied. "Over and over, proving you deserve the room you're already in." Dean did not answer immediately. He chose his words carefully because easy reassurance would not suffice. "Yeah," he said finally, "I get tired, but not of proving. I get tired of pretending I don't see what's happening. That's the part that wears on you." Sammy turned then, eyes steady but vulnerable. "You could have stayed out of it," he said. "Your career would have been simpler." Dean shook his head slowly. "Simpler isn't the same as better." The Don, meanwhile, remained distant but observant. He did not retaliate aggressively. That would have drawn unnecessary scrutiny. Instead, he recalibrated his attention elsewhere. "I'm allowing time to dilute memory. But men like him do not forget. They catalog. They assess. They wait." Dean knew this. It lingered at the edge of his awareness, like a distant storm that never quite disappears from the horizon. Frank's position became increasingly uncomfortable. He moved in overlapping circles, aware that loyalties were being quietly measured. Publicly, everything appeared intact. The performances continued. The camaraderie seemed intact under stage lights. But privately, conversations carried tension. Frank understood leverage and survival better than anyone. He also understood that Dean's refusal to bend had complicated arrangements that had once felt manageable. One night backstage in Chicago, Frank pulled Dean aside. There was no anger in his voice this time, only fatigue. "You made your point," Frank said softly. But it cost more than you think." Dean met his gaze evenly. "It cost what it was going to cost," he replied. Frank exhaled slowly. "You ever think about how much easier it would be if we just stayed entertainers?" Dean almost smiled. "We tried," he said. "The world doesn't always let you." The truth beneath their exchange was unspoken but understood. Fame creates proximity to power. Proximity to power invites influence. Influence demands choices. Those choices rarely come clean. They arrive layered with consequence. Dean had chosen clarity over convenience. That clarity reshaped his relationships in ways that would take years to fully surface. For Sammy, however, something fundamental shifted for the better. The confrontation, painful as it had been, crystallized something inside him. And he no longer felt like a guest at someone else's table. He felt like an equal who had survived a test. Dean's refusal to apologize had reinforced that identity. It told Sammy that dignity did not require approval from powerful men. It required allies willing to risk discomfort. That realization began to influence how Sammy carried himself publicly. He spoke more openly about equality in interviews. He challenged subtle slights with sharper wit. He refused certain venues that once would have felt too prestigious to decline. Dean noticed this evolution and felt a quiet satisfaction. The ripple effect of standing firm was not just protection, it was empowerment. Meanwhile, the Don observed from a distance. He saw that intimidation had failed to fracture the bond he attempted to weaken. In certain circles, that failure carries its own risk. Influence depends on perception. If word spreads that someone resisted successfully, others may grow bold. For that reason, the Don adjusted his strategy. Instead of direct interference, he redirected focus, new partnerships, different targets. Power, when intelligent, conserves itself rather than overextends. Time, as it always does, softened edges without erasing memory. Years passed, careers evolved, public narratives shifted. Yet occasionally, in private gatherings, the story of that night resurfaced quietly. Not as legend, not as gossip, but as a reminder. "Remember Tahoe?" someone would murmur. Eyes would meet. A subtle nod would follow. The meaning was clear without elaboration. Dean rarely discussed it in interviews. He had no interest in dramatizing conflict. He understood that the moment mattered not because of who the Don was, but because of who he chose to be. Courage rarely needs an audience. It only needs consistency. He carried that principle into other aspects of his life, into negotiations, into friendships, into decisions that required moral clarity. There were moments when he wondered privately whether he had underestimated the danger, whether luck had played a larger role than principle. But even in those reflections, regret never fully formed. Regret requires wishing you had acted differently. Dean did not. One evening, years later, after a particularly powerful performance by Sammy, they sat together in a quiet corner of a nearly empty theater. The stage lights had cooled. The audience had gone. The silence felt earned. Sammy turned to Dean with a reflective expression. "You know," he said, "if you hadn't stood up that night, I might have laughed it off and let it pass. I've done that before." Dean listened. Sammy continued, "But I would have carried it differently. It would have chipped something away." Dean nodded slowly. "That's why I didn't let it pass." Sammy smiled, not widely, but deeply. "You didn't just stand up for me. You changed how I see myself." Dean looked away slightly, uncomfortable with praise. "You did that," he replied. "I just refused to sit down." The ripple effects extended beyond their friendship. Other performers noticed the solidarity. They saw that influence could be challenged without catastrophe. They saw that alliances mattered. In an industry where competition often eclipses unity, that example resonated quietly but powerfully. The Don's presence in their lives diminished over time, replaced by other figures and other pressures. Power shifts, eras change. What remains constant is character. Dean's character, shaped by that night, carried forward into other decisions. He became less tolerant of subtle prejudice, less willing to entertain quiet humiliation disguised as humor, more deliberate in choosing where he lent his name. Standing firm did not make life easier. It complicated contracts. It strained friendships. It invited scrutiny. But it also created clarity. And clarity, though sometimes costly, anchors a man in ways convenience never can. Years later, when the noise of that era had faded into history, the confrontation by the lake no longer felt like a risk narrowly survived. It felt like a defining line. Before it, and there had been ambiguity about how far loyalty extended. After it, there was none. Dean had demonstrated that loyalty was not conditional on comfort. It was rooted in conviction. The weight of standing firm does not disappear once the moment passes. It settles into identity. It becomes part of how you respond to future tests. And for Dean, that identity, the man who would not allow a friend's dignity to be negotiated, remained intact long after the lake grew quiet again. Time has a way of reshaping conflict. What once felt immediate and dangerous becomes reflective and instructive. The names that once carried weight lose some of their edge. Influence fades, fear diminishes, but character endures. As the years passed, the confrontation at the lake no longer felt like a standoff with power. It felt like a turning point in identity. Dean rarely revisited the night publicly. Not because he feared consequences, by then, the landscape had shifted, but because he did not believe in revising the past for applause. The moment had not been theatrical. It had not been delivered with dramatic flair. It had been quiet and deliberate. That quiet mattered. The world often misunderstands courage as something loud and defiant. In truth, it is often measured and steady, born from conviction rather than performance. Sammy's career continued to evolve in ways that neither of them could have predicted during those tense months. He became not just an entertainer but a symbol, a bridge between audiences, a visible challenge to assumptions. The prejudice he faced did not disappear, but it encountered resistance in new forms. And doors that once closed without explanation began opening with intention. And though the world was far from fair, progress no longer felt entirely hypothetical. Dean watched that evolution with pride he rarely verbalized. He did not see himself as the catalyst. He understood that Sammy's resilience had existed long before that night. What he recognized, however, was that solidarity changes momentum. When someone refuses to let humiliation pass unchallenged, it alters the balance. It introduces friction where complacency once lived. That friction does not immediately topple structures, but it prevents them from standing comfortably. The Don's influence gradually receded into the background of their lives. Other alliances formed. Other power centers rose and fell. What once felt like an immovable force became another chapter in a shifting landscape. Dean understood something important through that transformation. Power that depends on intimidation is rarely permanent. It relies on perception. Once that perception is cracked, even slightly, its authority begins to thin. There were moments in later years when Dean reflected privately on the risk he had taken. Not the theatrical version of risk that tabloids thrive on, but the quieter, more personal kind. He had risked contracts. He had risked access. He had risked friendships. He had risked stepping outside the comfort of neutrality. Neutrality is attractive. It protects reputation. It avoids entanglement, but it also erodes something essential if practiced too often. One evening, many years later, long after the lake had returned to being just a memory, Dean and Sammy found themselves seated together in a dim backstage lounge after a benefit performance. Age had softened them both. Their energy was slower, their laughter deeper and less rushed. They spoke not of contracts or audiences, but of the strange journey of their lives. At one point, Sammy leaned back and said quietly, "You know what stayed with me?" Dean raised an eyebrow slightly. "What?" Sammy replied. "Not what he said. Not the pressure afterward. What stayed with me was the moment you decided I wasn't sitting there alone." Dean did not respond immediately. Compliments about courage always made him uncomfortable. He saw himself as practical rather than brave. But he understood what Sammy meant. Isolation magnifies humiliation. Solidarity dissolves it. "Nobody should sit alone in that kind of moment," Dean said finally. Sammy nodded slowly. "You'd be surprised how often they do." That was the real weight of the story, not the confrontation itself, not the influence or the consequences. It was the understanding that dignity is fragile when unprotected. For someone like Sammy, who had navigated rooms where he was both celebrated and subtly othered, that protection mattered more than applause. It mattered more than contracts. It reinforced belonging in a world that frequently questioned it. Frank's relationship with Dean evolved too. Time tends to sand down resentment when perspective replaces urgency. They had both made choices under pressure. They had both navigated environments where compromise felt necessary. In later years, their conversations held more honesty than they once had. And there were no grand apologies, no theatrical reconciliations, just mutual recognition that survival often demands different strategies. Dean had chosen confrontation. Frank had chosen negotiation. Both had carried consequences. In interviews late in life, when asked about loyalty, Dean often answered with simplicity. "You know who your people are," he would say, "and when it matters, you act." That philosophy extended beyond show business. It was rooted in something older, something shaped long before fame. Growing up, he had learned that respect cannot be demanded. It must be lived. And lived respect includes standing firm when it costs something. The entertainment industry changed dramatically over the decades. New generations entered without the same barriers or alliances. Some never knew the kind of subtle pressure that once operated behind closed doors. Others faced different versions of it. The form changes. The principle remains. Influence still tests integrity. Power still attempts to define belonging. And individuals still decide whether to remain silent or speak. Dean's decision that night did not dismantle prejudice. It did not transform the industry overnight. But it created a small but permanent shift in the dynamic of their circle. It made clear that certain lines could not be crossed without resistance. It demonstrated that loyalty, when enacted publicly, can recalibrate rooms that assume silence. As Dean aged, he grew quieter about many things, but not about this principle. He did not narrate the story often. He did not dramatize it. But in subtle ways, through how he treated colleagues and how he reacted to injustice, the lessons surfaced. He no longer tolerated jokes that masked insult. He no longer brushed aside implications disguised as humor. Experience had sharpened his discernment. Near the end of his life, when asked what mattered most in retrospect, he did not mention box office numbers or record sales. He spoke about friendships, about trust, about the rare moments when you are tested not by performance, but by principle. "You don't always get a warning," he once said quietly. "Sometimes you just get a moment, and how you handle it sticks with you." That was the true legacy of the night at the lake. It was not erased from history because it lacked drama. It faded because it was personal, because it unfolded in a private room without cameras. But its impact was real. It shaped how two men understood each other. It reshaped how they navigated power. It reminded them that courage does not require spectacle. In the end, what remained was not the Don's influence or his implied authority. What remained was the bond strengthened by shared adversity. What remained was the memory of a decision made quietly but firmly, and what remained was the understanding that dignity, once defended, becomes harder to undermine. Power fades, influence shifts, rooms change, but character, once revealed, endures in the stories people carry forward. And in this story, the defining moment was not the attempt to humiliate. It was the refusal to accept it.